Hey Pisces, this is your year ahead horoscope and astrology forecast for the entire year of 2026. Joining me today is astrologer Leisa Schaim, and I'm Chris Brennan of the Astrology Podcast, and we're going to give you an entire year ahead forecast for the next 12 months. So, hey Lisa, thanks for joining me and doing horoscopes with me this year.
Hey Chris, glad to be here.
Yeah, so for our horoscopes, we'd recommend looking at them from the perspective of your rising sign if you know your birth time. Although, if you don't know your birth time, then you can also look at your sun sign. So, this is going to be just a big picture overview of the major trends and themes and transits this year. So, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So, here's the planetary movements calendar that shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the year and how far through the signs of the zodiac they'll get by the end of the year. And here's some of the major transits we're going to start talking about over the course of this forecast, beginning with the Saturn Neptune conjunction that's going to take place in February, because this is important in marking the start of a long term transit where both Saturn and Neptune are going to depart from their long transits through the sign of Pisces and move into the sign of Aries starting in January and February. So, this is really important, of course, because Pisces is your first house of mind, body, and self that Saturn and Neptune are going to be departing from. And then it's going to move into Aries, which is your second house of money, finances, possessions, and personal resources. So major shift right at the top of the year, yeah?
Yeah, definitely, and especially for Pisces rising. So Saturn and Neptune leaving your first house should probably be really good news for you overall because it tends to be a heavier feeling time when Saturn is transiting your first house. You may have done kind of more work on restructuring your sense of self or just having heavier responsibilities on you. But with Neptune there, there's also a sense of nebulousness surrounding who you are. Sometimes there can also be kind of energy leakages where it's not the highest energy time with Saturn and Neptune going through your first house, physically speaking, or there could have even been nebulous health things that came up from time to time. So the good news is that both of those are leaving your first house of self, and they are now going to move into your second house of personal income and finances, and they're going to make an exact conjunction there in the second house in February. So, what that means for you, a few things. One of the things that it can mean is that there were structures that you have in place for your personal income and finances that are dissolving at this time, but there can also be for other people or for the same people a time when you're kind of dreaming new dreams about how you can make a living or different things you can do to make a living, sources of income, and how you can make that real. So you're going to be blending the reality principle of Saturn with the sort of dreams and imagination of Neptune.
Yeah. So on the one hand, this is a little bit tricky because it's great that we have the alleviation of some of the body and health transits that especially Saturn represented since March of 2023 when it went into your first house, and feeling like a weight is sort of like lifted off your shoulders at this time, ending such a heavy transit like that that's lasted for 3 years. But on the other hand, having Saturn going into your second house can be more of a time of some challenges arising when it comes to your finances, and sometimes like an obstacle or a surmountable difficulty coming up that you have to overcome. The issue, though, is that with this conjunction going exact in February, this is the peak of what I call like the reality distortion field, where it's become increasingly difficult over the past few years as this conjunction has moved together to tell the difference between what's real and what's not, or between what's true versus what's false. And we've all seen that with like the advent of AI generated video that's really ramped up over the past few years as this conjunction grows closer, which is being sort of perfected right now. But it's also hitting each of us in terms of our personal life in certain sectors of the chart and certain areas of our life. And for you, it's really peaking here when it comes to the area of money and finances, so that there may be some ambiguity about how to get out of this period of surmountable difficulties with finances that starts to arrive and what the best way is forward. And you want to be really careful in February because you may not have a clear picture of what exactly is going on and should probably avoid making major financial decisions around that time. But the good news is that after February, that conjunction will start to dissipate. So hopefully the intensity of that sort of reality distortion field will recede a little bit into the background after that time.
Definitely. And we got a preview of this already. So in the second half of 2025, in particular in July, when Saturn and Neptune were both in Aries, but also got the closest they got to exactly conjunct in July, it was less than a degree apart. So if you think back to what was going on for you in that area of life in July in personal income and finances, you may get a sense of what to expect around February.
Absolutely. And by the end of this transit, because the Saturn transit will last like, what, 2 more years through 2028, you'll end up having created new structures in your life in terms of making money and setting up a positive financial foundation, and taking that area of your life perhaps more seriously than you have up to that point. But by the end of the transit, that should be a constructive thing in terms of putting those new structures in place to create a more solid foundation for the future.
Mhm.
So I like the sound of that. So that's our first major transit of this year. Now we move into the next one, which is the first eclipse season takes place from February through March. And this first eclipse season happens in the signs of Aquarius and Virgo, which is your 12th house and your seventh house. So those are kind of an interesting set of houses to have as part of the focus because the 12th house activation is tied in with a new series of eclipses where this year you're going to have eclipses starting in your 12th house and then 6 months later in your sixth house. And that's kind of the health axis of your chart where the 12th house usually tends to deal more with mental health, whereas the sixth house has more to do with physical health. So there's something about health that becomes more of the focus this year in some major beginnings and major endings when it comes to that area of your life.
hmm So let's just think about the first one. The first eclipse is in Aquarius in your 12th house. So that can bring up health things. It can bring up greater focus on mental health. It can also bring up things having to do with enemies, aka people you don't get along with or kind of who work against you in some way, even intentionally or unintentionally. So it can bring up something around that you have to deal with. But for sometimes and for some other people, it can just be a time where you have a sudden beginning or ending with regard to contemplative action. So, like beginning a meditation practice is a great, like, constructive 12th house eclipse thing. Um, just time spent more behind the scenes, even just like working alone behind the scenes can also be a 12th house thing. So there can be different things that come up, although health may become a greater part of it as we get to the other eclipse.
Yeah, and it's interesting those 12th house themes of seclusion that can come up with the first eclipse in Aquarius, because then, of course, the second eclipse in Virgo is in the seventh house of relationships and one-on-one interactions with other people and partnership. So there's some sort of almost tension there, some sort of interaction between one thing pulling you more towards seclusion and internal explorations of mental health and things like that, versus the other eclipse that's focusing more on relationships. But the first eclipse is kind of a new energy because it's the beginning of a new eclipse series, whereas the second eclipse in Virgo, this is like the middle point of a series of eclipses that started in Virgo in 2025 and carry through into 2027. So this represents major beginnings and major endings for relationships, where sometimes if you're in a relationship, you can have a relationship that reaches the end point in terms of the end of its life cycle. If you decide that relationship is no longer what you want in your life, and you can have the end of one relationship and the beginning of another. If you're single, sometimes it can be about starting a new relationship and entering into like a new important era of your life in terms of one-on-one relationships with people. So that can be kind of exciting, but it brings a weightiness to that area of your life where relationships are more dominant for some reason.
Definitely. And that's typically how they're experienced in like personal romantic relationships, but there can also be important beginnings and endings with regard to working one-on-one with another person, whether that's like a business partnership, or even if you do client work, that can be an important time of beginnings and endings around that for you.
Definitely, definitely. All right, so that's the first eclipse season. So moving on, the next major transit is that the planet Uranus has spent the past 7 years or so in the sign of Taurus, going through your third house of communication. all the way back since like 2018 and 2019, and it's finally finishing up through that sign, and it's moving into the sign of Gemini starting in April, which is moving into your fourth house of home and living situation and parents. So this is a major shift because Uranus spends about 7 years in each sign, and so a large part of it is wrapping up and figuring out the final lessons of what you were learning as Uranus is going through the third house. And the third house can relate to siblings and your relationship with them, if you have any. It can relate to extended family like cousins, aunts, uncles, or even grandparents. But also, it can relate to your neighborhood and your local environment outside of your house, as well as how you get around that neighborhood, such as your car or however you sort of like get around your city, basically.
Definitely. So that transit is almost through. We'll just have one last intensification of that in February when Uranus stations for the last time in Taurus, and then a bunch of inner planets activate that all month. And then it moves into your fourth house of home and family, living situation, things having to do with parents or ancestry, things from the past. Uranus transits through the fourth house are really classic for moving, right? The energy of Uranus is like sudden change, unexpected change, wanting to break free of something that's felt stagnant for a while, or just wanting new experimentation. And so that energy is coming to the area of your home and your living situation. So a really common thing that comes up is people suddenly moving. Maybe you weren't even thinking about moving like 6 months prior, for instance, and then all of a sudden you're like, I need to go. I need to go somewhere else, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That was what I did with that transit through my fourth house. Um, Years ago at the beginning of the Taurus transit was just like, we're moving, and then moved like the next month. And so sudden, unexpected, rapid change, but also a greater sense of a need for freedom and liberation in that part of your life. So that if there's something that's been holding you back in terms of your living situation, you'll have a sudden desire to suddenly change it very radically and very quickly, which can be very exciting in some instances.
Definitely. And I'm thinking about that interplay of Saturn leaving your first house, which can be more of like a serious vibe, more of a heavy vibe. And that's leaving, an angular house of your chart, especially the first house of your sense of self. And then Uranus suddenly coming into an angular part of your chart, meaning it's just more active. And it's like there's some reason where for which you're suddenly feeling like you can be more spontaneous, especially in the area of your home and living situation. This can also relate to if your parents are still around, they could be making sudden or unexpected changes in their lives. That's something that can commonly happen too, because when Uranus goes through any part of your chart that it refers to other people in your life, it can also be like representing stuff that's going on for them.
Yeah, so sometimes they can have a sudden urge for greater freedom and liberation, and sometimes that can be a little bit weird or awkward because they can start acting as like rebellious teenagers, regardless of their age, or can start making changes very rapidly, sometimes because they have this urge to be more authentic towards who they are and what they've always wanted to achieve and accomplish. And sometimes that can be a little surprising or unsettling from your vantage point, but ultimately, usually it's for the best.
Right. It just kind of shakes up like your foundations, your feelings of like where you come from or the people that came before you, but can bring like a really breath of fresh air as well to the same area.
Yeah, absolutely. But during the course of that, because it's transiting your fourth house, if you have planets in like the first house, it can be impacting your sense of self. It can be squaring your seventh house planets if you have any, like your descendant, which can be impacting relationships. And of course, it can oppose your 10th house planets, which can impact career. And it's just some of the ways that our home and living situation and private life and changes there can have ripple effects throughout the rest of our chart and the rest of our life.
Definitely.
All right, so that's that transit. Moving on to the next one. The next one to talk about is Jupiter and its transits this year, where it's going to spend the first half of the year in the sign of Cancer, which is your fifth house. But then starting in late June, it's going to move into the sign of Leo, which is your sixth house. So the fifth house is like the house of children, of fun and games and enjoyment, but also romantic affairs, sex and sexuality, and also hobbies. So the first half of the year is like growth and expansion with respect to some of those topics with Jupiter in that sign. Then the second half of the year is Jupiter moving into your sixth house, which is the house that pertains to work and to health.
hmm So the Jupiter transit through Cancer is an extension of the transit that started in the middle of 2025 and then lasts till the middle of 2026. So typically when Jupiter transits your fifth house, it's just a great time for having more fun, right? Like maybe, and especially, again, I keep coming back to, Saturn's leaving your first house, you're alleviating some sort of serious vibe that's been on you for a few years. And Jupiter transiting through your fifth house is just expansion of things that you do for pleasure. So it can also be for some people, it's a time for having children because Jupiter is expanding that signification of the fifth house. But it can also just be like a time of, you're treating yourself to like, I want to have fun in life. It doesn't have to be always so serious. And I think that that's a great time to do so for the first half of 2026.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I'm glad you said that. So sometimes that can be like getting into new hobbies or finding new things that bring fun and enjoyment into your life and make life even more worth living just through the enjoyment that you find in having a hobby or having something that you're really into doing, which can also include like sports and games and creative outlets as well. Jupiter transit through the fifth house can be a very creative time where you sort of express yourself and find things within yourself that you're able to put out there into the world in concrete form.
Definitely. If you do any sort of creative work at all, whether professionally or just, just for fun, it can be like more of a prolific time of greater creative output.
Yeah. So Jupiter going in your sixth house, though, in the second half of the year is putting more of the focus on health and work and trying to bring some positive things to that area of your life in terms of sometimes it can be like improving health matters or getting a hold of health matters and trying to find ways that you can improve them. Other times it's helping to improve things in the workplace. So sometimes that can be like a promotion. Other times, if there's people that you work with, or especially people that work for you, if you find yourself in some sort of managerial role, you can find yourself having good relationships with people at work in a way that makes you feel a little bit more optimistic or positive about the workplace in some ways.
Definitely. Yeah, it's definitely a better time for positive working relationships. And if you need to, hire someone even one-off to help you with something, either work related or even things that are unrelated to work, like cutting your hair, you need a person to do that. It can be a great time for new positive relationships to come into that area.
Definitely, definitely. And we'll come back to the sixth house because this is actually the first of three different transits hitting the sixth house this year, showing that this is going to be a really important sector of your chart over the next 12 months.
Mhm.
All right. So one last thing about this point is before Jupiter leaves Cancer in June, there's this very auspicious looking Venus-Jupiter conjunction that takes place towards the beginning of that month, which will happen in your fifth house of children, romance, and creativity, and could represent a very positive event with respect to those topics right at the beginning of June when those two planets form that conjunction. And we actually found this because we just finished researching and released our 2026 Electional Astrology report, where we went through and picked out the most fortunate dates in 2026 based on the principles of electional astrology.
Right. So basically, the principle of electional astrology is you pick out the best dates and times to start new ventures or take important actions, and it'll give you better odds of successful results. So that's what we've done for you is pick out all the best dates and times in the entire year of 2026.
Yeah, so we've got 28 auspicious charts and dates, along with tutorials about how to use them and to adapt them to your city. And one of the things we did is we went through each of the next 12 months and we gave you a forecast of the astrological weather for each month, telling you not just the good days to do things, but also some of the bad days to really avoid starting major things or taking actions. Because sometimes electional astrology is just as much about knowing what days to avoid as it is knowing what days to gravitate towards doing things. So you can get this report, and it's a video report that comes with an audio version as well as a detailed written report as a PDF. And you can use it for business, love, or pretty much any major life event next year. So the report's on sale, but only for the first month for $49.95. But then the price is going to go up to $65 starting in January. So you can get the report now at the sale price at theastrologypodcast.com/2026 report. All right, so that takes us into the second half of the year. Let's take a look at the transits coming up in the second half of 2026, where the next one is we get our second eclipse season when a pair of eclipses in Leo and Pisces take place in August into early September. So this is happening in your sixth house of work and health, as well as your first house of mind, body, and appearance.
hmm So the first one in Leo is the very first one in the Leo series. We had the Aquarius piece earlier in the year, and now there's the Leo eclipse. And so that's putting extra attention on that same area we were just talking about, where you're having the Jupiter transit through the sixth house of work and health in this whole second half of 2026. And now an eclipse comes to the same area, and it's going to bring important beginnings or endings or both to that area of life. So that can be ending one job and starting a new job because of the workplace piece of the sixth house. It can be beginning or ending like a health routine, you start going to the gym for the first time in years, for instance. It can be that kind of thing. It can be beginning a new relationship with like a health professional that helps you with your health. Those sorts of things can come about with the eclipse there.
Yeah, so this really adds some weightiness to this area of health and work that weren't there by just looking at the Jupiter transit that starts in June, which is more like positive growth and optimism and things like that. But when eclipses start happening in the sixth house, it indicates something more long ranging is starting to take place and is starting to formulate in your life at this time. And it's happening on this whole health axis where the eclipse 6 months earlier in March and February was in the mental health axis, whereas this one's taking place in the physical health axis. And I think part of this is just really emphasizing the connection between mind and body and how sometimes you need to take care of your mental health because it can have an impact on your physical health, and vice versa, that it's important to take care of your physical health because it can have an impact on your mental health. And those are some of the themes that really come into focus by the time of this eclipse in August.
hmm And then the following eclipse in late August is going to be the last one in Pisces. And it is basically a time of bringing to conclusion a bunch of important activity that's been happening in your first house of self. So Saturn and Neptune have been there, Saturn for the last few years. We've also had a whole series of eclipses in Pisces in the first house. So this is going to be the very last one. So basically, the very last time of an important beginning or ending or both with regard to your sense of identity, something about body, appearance, how you present yourself, how you think of yourself, and things of that nature. So it can also bring some sort of closure to all the work that you've been doing during the past few years there.
Yeah, for sure. And just the back and forth that you've had in terms of eclipses in your seventh house, opening up major beginnings and major endings for relationships, but then this eclipse happening in the first house of self, and you sometimes needing to focus more on who you are and what your identity is and who you are outside of relationships. So you may have been swinging between extremes over the course of the past couple of years of eclipses in this axis of your chart, but this final one puts the final touch on whatever the evolution has been in terms of finding out more about who you are and what you need to live a happy life with this final eclipse in Pisces in your rising sign in August and early September. All right, so that's the eclipse season. So moving on, the next major transit is there's going to be a Venus retrograde in the signs of Scorpio and Libra in October and November. And this is taking place in your ninth house of education and travel and beliefs, going back into your eighth house of shared resources and other people's money.
Mhm. So this can be a time of re-envisioning or revisiting things around those two house topics. You could be I could see for some people, for instance, with Pisces rising, you could be revisiting an idea of going back to school, like if you had left school or something, or decided not to go to school at a certain point earlier in life, you could be re-envisioning that idea and especially exploring how do I finance that, right? With Venus going backwards through the area of higher education and then going retrograde as well through the eighth house, which can have to do with grants, scholarships, loans, as well as things like taxes, other people's money, etc. But that could be one way that those two houses could be connected during that retrograde.
Yeah, definitely. Another way is like since it's Venus, it could be involved like taking a long distance trip and getting the financial assistance to do so somehow, or taking a trip and then having some sort of financial windfall come as a result of that. I'm thinking, especially for the people with night charts, that this is going to be experienced as more of a positive transit, since night chart people tend to react to Venus transits and especially Venus retrogrades as being more beneficial, basically, in terms of life events. But whatever it is, you can think back to 8 years earlier because this same Venus retrograde transit happened way back in November and October of 2018, the last time that Venus went retrograde in Scorpio and Libra, or even 8 years before that in October and November of 2010. And sometimes there can be events or circumstances that occurred back during those previous retrogrades, or sometimes even people that come back into the present and become relevant again for some reason, because Venus retrogrades have this backwards looking orientation.
For sure. Yeah, and speaking of people, it could bring back, for instance, people you know at a distance, like who live in other countries. That's a pretty easy possibility with Venus retrograding through the ninth house. It could also be people you used to be connected with in like a religious community or something like that, with the ninth house of belief systems. Yeah, so and typically you're sort of re going back to the past or reviewing or rethinking things around those topics during the retrograde. And then once it goes forward, you're kind of moving into the future, having revisioned those things.
Yeah, for sure. And sometimes since it's connecting the place of belief and like religion with the eighth place, which can have to do with mortality, it can be about like revisiting and thinking about your views on that topic, on the topic of mortality, and what you connect with or what your personal philosophy is surrounding that and different things related to it. So it's good, it'll be good to think about some of those things during that time because it's kind of an interesting combination in terms of the ninth house and the eighth house.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
All right. So the final transit we need to talk about is besides the Venus retrograde transit later in the year, there's also a Mars retrograde transit that begins to build up towards the end of 2026. And then Mars doesn't actually station retrograde until January of 2027, but it's already entered its pre-retrograde shadow. And the two signs that it's going to retrograde in, which are Leo and Virgo, by late September through December of 2026. So this is important because this is going to be a Mars retrograde in your sixth house of work and health, as well as your seventh house of relationships and partnership.
Yeah, so typically during the build up to a Mars retrograde station, you're starting to put more energy and effort and attention into a certain area or areas of your life. So you're going to be doing that in the sixth house of work and health and the seventh house of partnership. But as you go, you'll start to get clues as to the things you're going to need to rework or redo once Mars goes retrograde in early 2027. So that's a nice thing about knowing that that's coming up is you can pay attention during the last quarter of the year and see what you might think is going to just take a little while. It's going to be a small project, usually gets stretched out a little bit because of that Mars retrograde. So it's just important to know that that's going to take an extra length of time in terms of your energy and attention in those areas. So with Mars going through your sixth house, that can be on the one hand, it's overlapping a lot, right, with the Jupiter transit there and with the first eclipse in Leo there in your sixth house. So you can be putting a lot of attention and energy, for instance, into a new job. That could be one area of life where you're doing that. It could also be that you're really trying to focus on working on your health. And so you're putting a lot of energy and attention. That can easily be a time when you're like getting more vigorous exercise, for instance. It's pretty common with like Mars through the first or the sixth. That's one way that can go. And especially if you have a night chart, it's going to be tending to be more constructive and also more moderated between the Mars and the Jupiter transits there. So Mars will just tend to be greater energy expenditure and vigorous effort in that area, whereas Jupiter won't be quite as positive in terms of its expansive qualities compared to if you have a day chart, but it will still be somewhat positive. Whereas if you have a day chart, you're going to get more of the extremes of, on the one hand, Jupiter's bringing really good things to that area of life for work or health, and then to relationships. But then Mars is going to bring more potential for conflict or potential for problems coming up. Injuries, for instance, can happen with Mars through the sixth in a day chart.
Yeah, for sure. Well, this being the third transit this year, that's really pointing us towards major things happening in the sixth house of work as well as health, shows us this is going to be a major focus this year. And the other two transits, especially the Jupiter transit, was more positive, and that's still going to be there counterbalancing the Mars transit. But the Mars transit shows us that it's not all going to be super easy, and there may be some obstacles that arise in this area during the second part of 2026 and especially the early part of 2027. So there may be a connection between partnership and health. We focused especially on the health and work factor here, but since this Mars retrograde actually begins in the seventh house, sometimes that can indicate some strife or separation or difficulties that arise in the context of partnership, especially if you're in an existing relationship at this point, or you could just go through a rough patch with a partner where they're more irritable or the two of you are getting in more fights than usual.
For sure. It can also connect those two where your partner is having a rough patch of health, for instance. And it's not really about your health, but it could be connecting those two topics with your partner.
Yeah. So the good thing, though, is the fact that Jupiter is transiting through the sixth house this year is really going to help counterbalance things. And then the following year, it will go into the seventh house to help smooth things out. And we really saw last year during the Mars retrograde in Leo and Cancer how the Mars retrograde, even sometimes when it would set up some issues or there would be some difficulties that arose, when Jupiter came in then later, subsequently, it really helped to smooth things out and to fix anything that got ruffled or broken during that time. So that'll be a good follow-up that's coming in the future.
Absolutely. That's definitely something to look forward to, although that does get us into 2027.
Yeah, I can already feel the gravitational weight of 2027 pulling us towards that and like starting to make us issue predictions already for 2027, even though we're supposed to stick to 2026. So maybe we have to exercise some restraint ourselves and call it a day.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks for joining me for this forecast, Lisa, and thanks everyone for watching. Those are your major transits for 2026. So for help, as we said, planning auspicious dates next year, you can get our 2026 Electional Astrology Report, which is on sale only in the next month for $49.95, but then the price goes up to $65 in January, which is still a steal, actually. And you can get it at theastrologypodcast.com/2026 report. Otherwise, if you want to learn more about our approach to interpreting birth charts, you can check out my Hellenistic astrology course at theastrologyschool.com. All right, good luck in 2026, and we'll see you again next year.